Lance wasn't exactly satisfied with his life, but any happiness he managed to cling to disappeared when he got his hands on a time machine. Only a month had passed since the untimely death of President John F. Kennedy and the timely death of his assassin. Apparently, Lance had come to realize, America had become such a superpower in the last 2 centuries that everyone in the world was required to give a shit about their internal affairs. Lance didn't care about JFK. He didn't much care about United Kingdom's politics either. He just wanted to get through his daily routine without any serious incident. The sun had set when Lance departed the firm, a thick jacket wrapped around his body. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, he pulled the collar of his jacket tighter around his neck. He was only 43, but he could already feel old age creeping up on him. The passing years manifested themselves in the form of increased irritation at the world and an inability to tolerate extreme temperatures. "Hey, you." Lance came to a stop beside an unusually dark alleyway. The streetlights did nothing to illuminate its negative space, and he could just barely make out the figure standing only feet away. This is not what I need right now, Lance thought, though there wasn't really anything going on that precluded him from interacting with people on the street. "What?" he said aloud, folding his arms and staring at the unkempt man. He was obviously homeless, and not the sort of eccentric drifter who might teach Lance a valuable lesson about the power of kindness. "I'm starving," the man said, his voice tinged with misery and a Yankee accent. "Can you spare $1? Anything." "I don't have any money," Lance replied automatically, not bothering to wonder if this was true. He wasn't even sure why he was humoring the man. "Anything," the man begged. He seemed to have all his teeth, Lance noticed, and they weren't too yellow. Perhaps he had been a regular bloke until very recently, until a divorce or a termination had dropped him to the gutter. "Want a fag?" Lance offered, almost shocked at his own generosity. The homeless man looked dubious for a moment, then shrugged. "Never really been a smoker, but why not?" Lance fished a couple of embassy filters out of his coat pocket, first lighting up, then giving one to the vagrant. The two of them stood there in the semi-darkness, and Lance allowed himself to accept that he actually wanted to strike up a conversation with the man. Must be a Christmas miracle. "Can I ask?" he began. "Ask what?" the man said, taking a shallow drag off the cigarette. He didn't inhale. "How this happened," Lance replied, gesturing towards the man. The vagrant seemed to think for a moment, then shrugged. "A lot of shit happened, all at the same time," he said. "Sorry to hear that," Lance murmured. He wasn't sorry so much for the man, as he was at the prospect of the man's fate befalling him as well. He made it sound so possible. "I'll survive," the man said, looking down at the ground. They stood there in silence, just on the alley's threshold, the smoke from their cigarettes drifting up to mingle with the city fog. Finally, the homeless man finished his and dropped the butt, putting it out with his shoe. A half-minute later, Lance followed. "Thanks again," the filthy man said, trying to meet Lance's gaze. "Hey, I've got something you might be interested in. You want to see?" Lance looked up. The homeless man wore an expression of interest, as if he'd been planning to ask this whole time. He probably had. "Not really," Lance returned. "I'd better get off back home. My sister's gonna—" "Just trust me," said the homeless man. He didn't smell terrible, Lance realized. "Stay here. I'll be back in a second." Lance didn't know what it was that kept him standing there, preventing him from disappearing and never thinking of the vagrant again. But stand there he did, and a few seconds later, the man reappeared. "Check it out," he said, producing a bundle of brown paper. Hesitantly, half believing he was looking at a bomb, Lance took the package. "What is it?" he asked. The man just nodded, prompting Lance to open it. Carefully, he began peeling off the bags, dropping them on the ground as he did. Inside was an object that Lance could only describe as something out of science fiction. A prop from one of the extravagant films that were so popular the decade before, or from that new BBC One program about the flying police box that had started up last month. The object was vaguely rectangular, though its 8 corners were rounded out like a loaf of bread. Its main body was made of a crimson metal, scratched and dented from what looked like years of abuse. Out of its left side protruded a thick, rusty gear whose cubical teeth jutted out to 4 degrees. On the top part of the device was a bubble of green-tinted glass, a hemisphere that, like the metal, had been scratched and marked. On the machine's face lay 2 horizontal plates of glass, behind which Lance could pick out hand-painted digits. 3 beneath the top glass, 2, 7, 4, and 4 beneath the bottom, 0, 2, 6, 1. Below the glass plates was a large red button, and corresponding to them was a pair of dials on the machine's right side. Feeling the weight of the metal device in his hands, Lance looked up at the homeless man. "What the hell is this?" he asked. "I don't know," the man replied. "I just found it in the alley. It looks..." Lance struggled to find the right words as his eyes flicked back and forth across the device's face. "It looks like a toy, but like a real version of a toy." He turned the object over. On the back, drawn with bold strokes in what looked like black paint, was number 4. "You want it?" the man asked. "Why would I want it?" Lance replied. He was curious now. At least more curious than he was when the man disappeared into the alley. But if neither of them knew what the device was for, then what use was it to him? "Hell if I know," the man said. "Just thought I'd offer, seeing as you're the only one who'd even talk to me." Turning the device all around in his hands, Lance noticed for the first time that someone had etched a swastika into the metal, just below where the gear protruded from the body. Suspicious, he thought. Maybe it's a German war machine. Someone passed the alleyway and the 2 men looked up. They must have seemed right stupid, Lance thought, standing there and gawking at some children's toy. "You don't got any idea what it does?" Lance asked. "No idea," the man grunted. "Obviously some kind of machine, but hell if I know what it does." A pause, then, "I think the dials are supposed to do something." "I could have told you that," Lance thought, but he gave the top dial a twist. With some protest, the corresponding digits began flipping around like the cards on a Rolodex. They went from 274 to 275, then to 276. After a minute of rotating the top dial, Lance had made it to 280. He tested out the bottom dial and successfully moved the lower 4 digits. It took Lance a minute to recognize the change in the device, but once he noticed, he couldn't ignore it. The device, the machine, the toy, whatever it was, had begun to buzz. It was a similar feeling to the hum of a car just starting up, or of a woman's hairdryer as it worked its magic. "Something's happening," Lance said, suddenly excited. Whatever the machine was, he had never seen anything like it, and he wanted to know what it did, even if it was no more than a toy. "Keep turning the dials," the homeless man suggested. His voice was casual, disinterested. As Lance fiddled with the knobs, he wondered vaguely if the man actually did know what the machine was for. Lance was about to point out that nothing much seemed to be happening other than the hum, when he did a double take and realized that a pinprick of light had begun to shine through the scratched green glass of the top dome. He barely registered as the homeless man grabbed him by the jacket and pulled him deep into the alley. "Something's happening," Lance said again as the light grew bigger. A greenish tint was projecting through the glass, illuminating the dark alleyway. The buzzing had grown stronger, and he felt it throughout his body, from his hands wrapped on the device all the way to the soles of his feet. "Why don't you try the button?" the man suggested. Lance's right hand shifted from cradling the device to hovering over its single round button. He paused, almost feeling as if he didn't want to know. But temptation was too great. Lance pressed his index finger down on the button, depressing it to the surface of the device, already thinking of how he would relate the story to his family. The light glowed brighter than ever, and the alley was almost clear as day. The homeless man stood there, watching with some semblance of interest, as Lance struggled to hold on to the vibrating machine. Inside the green dome, tiny sparks of white electricity were crackling and growing into miniature lightning bolts that played across the glass. The vibration of the machine was almost too much for him to bear, not painful, but contracting, sending shockwaves through his body. He felt as though he would drop the machine at any second, but somehow, the buzzing had the opposite effect, forcing his fingers to curl across the metal surface and hold on for dear life. He didn't realize that he had lost sight of everything around him, everything apart from the machine, until his eyes snapped shut and he felt himself falling backwards, trying to pinwheel his arms but clutching tight to the device, finally hitting the ground with a shock of pain throughout his body. He winced, squeezed his eyes tighter shut, and realized the device had ceased its vibration. When he opened his eyes, he saw daylight. "Jesus," he thought, shielding his gaze. "How long have I been out?" Slowly, groaning all the way, Lance pushed himself into a sitting position. The first thing he noticed was that the dark concrete of the alley had disappeared around him. The second thing was that the ground wasn't asphalt. It was dirt. Brown, untampered dirt, with disparate patches of dead grass scattered around. A faint whiff of something foul struck his nose. When he raised his eyes, he saw people. They were scattered around the alley, standing close by but trying to push themselves away from the unknown man. Their faces were shocked, mouths spread open and eyes wide. Lance wanted to tell them to calm down, to tell them it was just a mistake, but when he saw their clothes, his voice caught in his throat. Lance wasn't an expert on history. He hadn't given any past time periods much thought since university, but he could almost swear that he was looking at a group of Dark Age peasants. "Hello?" Lance muttered, scrambling to his feet. The peasants continued to stare at him. "No, this isn't right. This is..." He felt his throat close up, and he let out a dry, sickening retch. "This isn't right," he said again, his voice like sandpaper. Right or not, it was real. As he struggled to maintain his balance and the sheer impossibility of it all, Lance grew ever more positive that he wasn't hallucinating. The ugly, machine-made towers that jutted up into London's ever-cloudy sky had been replaced by 1- and 2-story houses, their walls irregular and obviously the product of human hands. In place of concrete and steel were thatch and daub. Where there should have been asphalt, there were now uneven cobblestones and lengthy patches of bare dirt. The sounds and smells of the city had been replaced with the sounds and smells of livestock. He planted both feet firmly on the dirt ground. His head was swimming and his gut felt wrenched, but the last thing he planned on doing was giving in to panic. A few of the people in the crowd had moved away, but most were still staring at him. And why shouldn't they? He was wearing bizarre clothes, was quite a bit taller than the tallest among them, and had apparently stepped into existence just off a busy street. Plus, if this really was the Dark Ages, then at 43 he was quite a few years past the average life expectancy. "Hello?" he said again, the greeting addressed to anyone who might be willing to speak. "You all speak English, yeah?" The peasants continued to stare at him. Most of them were holding their eyelids so wide open that he could see the diameter of their eyeballs. Lance had never been one to wax philosophical, but he found himself wondering, in his desperately inconsistent mind, whether someone from the modern day would have such an extreme reaction to a man from the future stepping into existence. Probably not. Exposure to science fiction, and all kinds of fiction for that matter, had desensitized modern folks. He took a step. The crowd shifted, everyone trying to keep their distance. He took another. They made way for him, allowing him free passage out of the alleyway, if the space between a pair of 2-story thatched buildings could really be considered an alleyway. Once he was on the street, Lance understood that the de-evolution of London wasn't an isolated incident. The entire area stank, and all the buildings were miserably old-fashioned. Not a single car was visible on what had, minutes before, been an overcrowded street. Now, people made their careful way across the uneven stones, their utilitarian clothes swishing back and forth, or rode in wagons pulled by sickly-looking horses. "Well," Lance said aloud. Out on the street, the citizens were giving him weird looks as they passed, presumably because of his security guard uniform and shoes made from real-life cows, but none of them had seen him appear out of nowhere, so none of them stopped to stare. Shit. He glanced down at the machine in his hand. He had almost forgotten he was holding it. Turning it over in his hands, he could see the painted number 4 standing out against the machine's crimson shell. "Number 4, he said aloud. What the hell did it mean? And who cares? Why was he grasping at straws when something incredible, something completely impossible had happened? He was in the Dark Ages. The goddamn Dark Ages. Either this was some elaborate prank involving dozens of actors and a huge movie set, or he had Rip Van Winkled himself into a post-apocalyptic future of medieval-looking civilization, or, somehow more likely than the other two options, he had gone back in time. "First man in history to go back in time," he muttered, slumping against the uneven wall beside him and realizing as he said this that he had no idea whether it was true. Doesn't feel too great, does it? And it didn't. The smell of medieval London was foul. The locals were already pissing him off, and anyways, he was supposed to be planning Christmas with his sister. "Let's see about getting me back to the present," he said. A grubby woman passed by with her equally grubby sons in tow. Lance began twisting the dials on the number 4. The printed cards flipped around, their numbers rising. The bubble of green glass didn't start to glow, but Lance had no reason to think it wouldn't. His fingers twisting the dials blindly, Lance began watching the peasants move back and forth, on their way to market or church or whatever the hell it was they did for fun before television and radio. Across the street, just visible behind a thick cloud of dust, was a small boy. He sat outside one of the low buildings, all by himself, his face blank. In one hand he held a stick, which he alternately thumped against the ground and used to trace abstract designs in the dirt. All of his exposed skin, and there was plenty of it, was covered in grime and what looked like a terrible rash. He seemed to be staring directly at Lance, and Lance stared back from all the way across the street. It wasn't until half a minute had gone by that Lance noticed the boy's trouser leg laying empty on the dirt, obliquely beside his bare, remaining foot. He couldn't have been older than 8. "Okay," Lance muttered to himself. "Time to go back." He looked down at the number 4 and felt his stomach drop as he realized the green glass hadn't lit up yet. He slammed the button down, but nothing happened. He twisted the dial some more, pressed the button again. Still, nothing. Come on, he hissed, feeling the panic rise in his chest. He didn't care if he was the first person to travel through time. He just wanted to go back. Or forward. Maybe when he learned to control the number 4, he could have plenty of incredible adventures through time and space. But for now, he had to— "God damn it!" he cried, throwing the machine on the ground. It skidded through the dirt, finally coming to a stop against the nearest building. Maybe it just had to charge, he thought. Maybe it could only be used once a day, or once a week, or once a lifetime. Though the thought first came to him in that moment, it would take Lance another 2 years before he could finally admit to himself that this must be the truth. The number 4 was a time machine. It could be used to travel to any point in history, but only once per person. It was like in childhood, he thought, when one's mother insists that they share a toy with their siblings. "You all get a turn," she would say. "That's only fair." Whoever had invented the number 4, as it was plainly created by man, not some sort of naturally occurring phenomenon, was like a mother to them all, to those coming after who would find the number 4 and feel its wrath. You all get one turn, that's only fair. You can go to any point in the past, but you have to stay there. Forever. The homeless man. If he was even really homeless. He would have been from the future, wouldn't he? The 1970s, or the 1980s, or the 21st century, or perhaps even later. He had been lucky enough to send himself back to modern day, or what was modern day to Lance, rather than a time before even the light bulb had been invented. Lance almost drove himself insane by admitting he would never return. But he came to accept this fact, in time, and was able to move on with his life. His new life, that was. In the old world. Lance became a blacksmith. After deducing that he was in the year 1542, and still holding out hope that the number 4 would one day be functional again, Lance decided to have some fun and get into the spirit of the times. He acquired, stole, new clothes and tried to pick up the local dialect, a harsh and vaguely Welsh-sounding parody of modern English. When it became apparent that the number 4 wouldn't be working anytime soon, Lance had dumped his wallet in the River Thames and procured an apprenticeship under a London blacksmith. The smithy had at first believed that Lance was too old for such an arrangement. He was, in fact, older than most of London's population, but Lance had insisted, and when the blacksmith died of something easily curable, Lance took command of the shop. The 1540s came and went. Lance grew to be known in the city, becoming somewhat wealthy in his trade. He was a favorite among the men, and the women adored him for his method of flirting that wouldn't be developed for another 4 centuries. He never took a wife, figuring the repercussions may be disastrous. Lance died in the year 1553, also of an easily curable disease. But before his body shut down, he made sure to leave his mark on the world, or, more appropriately, on the number 4. Taking a particularly sharp piece of iron from his shop, he spent the remainder of his strength scratching a message into the back of the red machine, just above the black number 4. He wrote, "You can't go back," the words as visible as he could make them. He also scratched 2 words into the face of the device, labeling the top row of digits days and the bottom row years. He wasn't totally sure those were what the numbers represented, but he made an educated guess for the sake of posterity. Lance never again saw the green glass of the number 4 light up. When he died, 367 years before his birth, everything in his shop was sold or stolen. The number 4 was carried off by a thief who thought it looked intriguingly alien. He sold it to a merchant, claiming it was a good luck charm. The merchant discovered this was not so true when he was murdered by bandits, who took the number 4 and tried to break it open to explore its contents. When they were unable to break the red casing, they carried it with them. The bandits were arrested and hanged, all their belongings becoming property of the crown. Queen Elizabeth I, and so far only, herself admired the number 4's colorful aesthetic and carried it as a scepter, before it was stolen by a court musician. When the musician was discovered, he dropped the number 4 in the Thames, hoping to escape sentencing. He was put to death anyway. The number 4 sank almost 10 meters down the Thames before coming to a stop, held in place by several centuries worth of raw, coagulated sewage. 300 years later, a literal perfect storm of melting snow and heavy rain caused the Thames to flood, killing 14 and displacing thousands. One of these now homeless Londoners happened across the number 4, washed up on a back street, and cleaned it up to give his daughter as a toy. After his death, his now adult daughter wondered about the number 4's origins, but, being unable to sell it, eventually gave the device to a museum, where it would sit forgotten in a storeroom for 15 years. The curator at the time had been taking advantage of his position to steal from the museum, and quickly added the unknown device to his collection. He would later trade the number 4 to a bartender in exchange for a bottle of whiskey. The bartender would present the number 4 to a historian friend of his, a man named Max. Max realized the machine's true purpose almost immediately, and prepared for his trial run. On July 15th, 1959, Max used the number 4 to travel back 200 years in 0 days. On July 15th, 1759, a man appeared out of nowhere in the middle of a London market, just as another man had done 200 years earlier. Max had already deduced that he would have little chance of returning to the present, and he accepted his fate with dignity. He set himself up as a London merchant, having no trouble picking up the customs of the time. He considered this experience a dream come true for a historian such as himself, the chance to explore history in living color, even if he could never report his findings. When he had explored everything there was to explore about the mysterious device, Max passed it on. On August 7, 1760, Maxwell, the enigmatic merchant who had literally and figuratively appeared out of nowhere, met a young man named David. David was 17, a midshipman aboard the frigate Laurel, but he wasted no time in explaining to Maxwell that he planned on being a captain very soon. "Sometimes I try to imagine what it'll be like," David said as they stood there on the London docks, surrounded by the wares Maxwell had been able to scrounge up in the last year. "To stand on the quarterdeck and maintain command over an entire vessel." He shook his head, lost in the image. "I can't imagine anything I would enjoy more." "I might know something," Maxwell said before he could stop himself. Was this boy really who he wanted to take control of a time machine? A 17-year-old? In Max's time, 17-year-olds weren't even allowed to vote, let alone travel freely through the fourth dimension. But then again, he thought, wasn't that the spirit of the number 4? He couldn't say what its original purpose was or who had invented it, but as far as his main theory went, the number 4 had been making its rounds throughout history for some time. There wasn't any real way to measure time when considering a device that could go back instantly, all the while moving forward at a steady rate of 1 second per second. "I don't believe you," David replied, a smile playing across his young face. He was handsome, Maxwell thought. In the 1950s, he would have found himself surrounded by a gaggle of young women. But here, wearing slop trousers and smelling of fish, plus the natural odor of the time period, Maxwell didn't think the midshipman would have much success in that department. "Would you like to make that a wager?" Maxwell asked, glancing around the docks to make sure no one was watching them. He reached into his purse and withdrew a key, which he used to unlock a small chest he had ordered in custom dimensions. He pulled open the top, removing the number 4. David's eyes seemed to struggle between widening in surprise and frowning in confusion. "What is this?" he asked. Poor kid, Max thought. At least when he had been introduced to the number 4, it had been in a time period where everyone was familiar with colored metal and the entire concept of buttons and dials. It's a magic item, he explained, feeling a rush of excitement. He had been waiting for this moment ever since accepting that the number 4 only went one way. Magic, David repeated, meeting Maxwell's eyes. Surely you don't expect me to believe that. I do. Maxwell went on to explain both the concept of time travel and the truth of his origins. At first, David couldn't grasp either of these tall tales, but eventually, he caught on. Maxwell showed David how the number 4 operated, how to use the dials in conjunction with the big red button. He explained that some previous user must have scratched the words days and years into its surface. What he didn't explain was the cryptic note written in ugly lines above the number 4. Max knew what "you can't go back" meant, but he didn't want David to understand. If he knew he could never return to his own time, he might never use the number 4. And if the machine never got used, it would never continue its circuit through time. David set sail on the frigate Laurel soon after. When he returned to London nearly a year later, he found Maxwell and revealed the bad news. He had lost the number 4 over the side of the ship just before he planned on using it. He had left his bunk during the night and gone up on deck, where he began fiddling with the controls. The current watch had noticed him and asked him what exactly he was doing, startling him into dropping the device over the gunwale. The number 4 once again found itself sinking into deep, cloudy darkness. This time, instead of the mucky waters of the sewage-infested River Thames, it floated down into the depths of the Atlantic Ocean, where it was molested for centuries by bottom-dwelling animals. The pressure of the deep sea threatened to break its glass plates, while the salt tried to clog up its gears. But still, the number 4 waited, unbroken, for its next user. And that was part 1 of The Number 4 by myself, Nathaniel J. Nelson. I'm not sure how many parts this story will be split into, but it is quite long. It's actually around 19,000 words, so firmly in the novella category. If you wanted to read the whole thing, it is available on my website. I should have part 2 out pretty soon. If you like this part, as always, please drop a like and subscribe. I'm really trying to hit 200 subs in the next couple months, so if you guys felt the urge to share this video on Twitter or Instagram or wherever else, it would be greatly appreciated. In addition, if you also happen to be a narrator, I am looking for collaborators for future parts of this same story, either to do the narrative or the dialogue. So if you're interested in that, hit me up on Twitter or Instagram or wherever, and we can work something out.